Now, a few words about positions with isolated pawn. Well, let's take it. It may happen from various different openings. Can happen from Caro-Can, as we just looking now, and it can happen from Queen's Gambit, accepted or declined, and it can happen from Grunfeld or various different openings. But we cannot just now look at all these positions one by one, but what I would like to do now to show you, to explain basic principles of positions with isolated pawn. CD, knight takes d5, bishop d3, castles and castles. Now, this is basically position where white has isolated pawn on d4 and black has outpost for a knight on d5. Now, who is this position better for? Well, everything, remember, if you have an isolated pawn, you have to create some threats and develop pressure or the attack, direct attack on a king side. Rook e1, knight c6. I've seen a lot of times it was played a3, and when black goes back to f6 with a knight, because you cannot play b6, because then white nearly wins the game after queen d5, bishop e4, and on queen d7, queen c2, attacking the knight and h7 pawn. So if black goes knight f6, so what white should do, play bishop c2, queen d3, and by then black develops bishop g5, rook d1, and have some kind of a possibility to attack on the king side. For example, after h6, knight e5, maybe queen h3. One thing you definitely cannot do in those positions while having isolated pawn is just to play bishop e3, rook c1 to make general moves and put rooks here. You must play on the king side. The reason why you cannot play passively with white, because then black is going to play knight b4, knight d5. They're going to stabilize their position, and all you're going to have is a weak pawn and a lot of problems for the rest of the game because of this weak pawn. So remember, if you have an isolated pawn, you definitely want to create pressure or some kind of attack on the king side, and that's the main principle in these positions. And if you play against isolated pawn, you should neutralize the same attack we just talked about. Now, the exception is position of Tarrasch defense. Tarrasch, c5, c takes d, ed. Well, in this position, white has a chance to fianchetto the bishop. The difference between this position and the others, that it's difficult for black to attack on a king side. But what black has to do after bishop g5, cd, knight takes d4, h6, and bishop e3. Well, we have here same pawn structure, slightly different approach by black. They cannot just go bishop d6 and all of a sudden develop attack on a king side, but what they have to do, the rule remains the same. Black must play actively this position, or they're going to find themselves in a lot of trouble. So they're going to go rook e8, maybe bishop c5 or bishop g4, queen d7, rook d8, bishop h3. They cannot just sit and guard d5 pawn, because this is very, very bad. Well, this is kind of a couple of basic principles of playing with an isolated pawn in the center. well, we know we can get this position very frequently. So now let's look at the positions with a frozen pawn center. What I'm talking about is frozen pawn center, and when you have d4, d5, e4, e6, e5. Now this position is a frozen pawn center. Or if we put the pawn on e3, f5, f4. This is frozen pawn structure because it's very unlikely that black can go e5 or white can go e4 ever. So how do you treat positions with a frozen pawn center, a pawn structure? Very important, remember, frozen pawn structure, well, I'm talking about there's some positions that you don't have double or triple pawns, of course, normally frozen positions. Remember, when you play frozen pawn structure positions, it's very important to have right pieces on the board. Let's look at one of the game I brought. I especially like this game because it's very, very typical for frozen pawn structure example. d4, f5, it's been played by one of the best chess strategists in the history, by Tigran Petrosyan, former world champion. Bishop g5, c6. We're not going to pay much attention to the beginning of the game. d5, e3, queen b6, rook b1, knight f6, knight g2, f3, knight b d7, c4, e6, a3, bishop e7, bishop e2, black castles, white castles, a5, queen c2, and a4 by black. Here is the position. We see the frozen pawn structure. Black has so-called stone wall pawn structure, and at the same time they have some kind of weakness on e5. We see how white took advantage of it. Main problem for black is a bad c8 bishop. White played cd. Now, never make move like this if black can capture with a pawn, with the e-pawn, because then black has very good and solid pawn structure. However, Petrosyan took on d5 because black cannot play e takes d, since queen takes f5, because of queen takes f5. So by taking c takes d, black was forced to recapture with a pawn, rook bc1. Now we see the first results. There is bishop on c8 that is very badly placed. c-file is totally controlled by white, and we're going to get soon to the advantages of a pawn structure. And you see how white took advantage of it. e5 square. So bishop d6, knight to b1. This is very important because knight goes to the better square on c3, knight e4, and now bishop f4. Okay, here white after bishop takes f4 and ef, white voluntarily goes for double pawn and created themselves weak d4 pawn. But it's important fact that black has very bad bishop on c8. That's why this pawn structure favors white, because white's pawns stand on black squares, and there is no dark square bishop, so they don't have so-called bad bishop. Black's pawns are on white, and light square bishop is really bad here. Black played knight b8, trying to bring knight to the better square to c6, knight c3, and bishop d7, rook f to d1. White is preparing to go with a knight to e5, but they have to protect d4 pawn first. Rook c8, knight e5, queen d6. Now white plays queen d3, getting out of the pin. Knight to c6, black plays f3. That's the difference. White plays f3, and that's the difference between outpost on e5 for white and outpost on e4 for black, because white's outpost on e5 is permanent when black's knight got kicked out by f3. Knight to f6, rook to c2. Now white is trying to double on c-file. Knight a5. Black is trying to put the knight on b3. Now rook d to c1 makes no sense. Queen to e3. Knight to b3. But what we see now you're going to see the advantages of this pawn structure for white. Even the doubled pawn, white loses to their advantage because of very strong centralized knight on e5 and favorable pawn structure where our pawns are on dark squares, and we have a better bishop than black does, and white played g4 in this position. It's obvious that it's bad for black to take fg, because after white takes fg and they go bishop d3, there is a potential of a very strong attack on a king side after g5, followed by king h3. And obviously black did not capture on g4 and played bishop e8. Now white played g5 and black went to knight h5. Now g5 is a very interesting move. Now I think maybe a little bit better would have been knight d7. However, that also leaves white with some advantage. But knight h5 was played by the black. Now black has target on f4, black has target on d4. However, this knight on h5 is absolutely immobile, and all he does attacks f4 pawn, but there is no other features for this knight and no future. Same goes for the knight on b3, attacks the d4 pawn and does nothing else. So you have to see that black's pawn structure, white's pawn structure determines clear advantage after bishop to d3, rook a to b8, knight to e2. Now white's plan is clear. Black played b5, rook takes c8, and rook takes c8, and bishop to b1. Well, here white could have done knight g3 and also had big advantage, because now we have very unorthodox pawn structure, and white has the h-file, also big advantage for white. But it's interesting to notice how Petrosian quickly converts it to nearly a winning position. He plays bishop to b1, and after bishop to b1, black tries to get some activity. You see, after bishop to b1, white may be playing knight d3 and knight b4 too, and maybe even king f2 and knight g3 later. But main idea of playing bishop b1 is possibly bishop a2 and attacking knight on b3. And after bishop takes b3, black will have a lot of problems. Anyway, black played b4, and after ab and queen takes b4, White played knight d3, queen d6, now knight e5, g6, bishop a2, and after queen b6, knight c3. This position is really, really bad for black, and white went on to win the game. Now they have no plan. They cannot go a3. They have no active a3. White simply takes. There is no active plan, and a total triumph of white's pieces because of the favorable pawn structure. Knight on h5 and knight on b3 are total spectators in this part of the game. Now this was very well played game by white. Now what I want to tell you is this. I played a lot of games against top-rated computers where it's very difficult to teach computers to program pawn structure. You can teach them combination, basic principles, and basically computers know that only way you can determine whether they know that any doubled pawn is disadvantage. Well, I played a lot of times the pawn structure that is clearly better for white. And it's interesting, all the computer programs, they go for this pawn structure because, well, let me show you the pawn structure I'm talking about. e6, e3, bishop d6, c3, c5, knight d2, bishop takes f4, e takes f, and then castle, d takes c, queen c7, attacking f4 pawn g3, queen takes c5, knight b3, and after queen c7, bishop d3. Now this is position I'm convinced and I believe strongly that is an advantage for for white, sorry. So, and the reason why white has two knights, they both have potential outposts on e5 and d4. They have very strong bishop on d3 that is looking towards the black's king side. And after attack, white may activate the g pawn. For example, in something like this, if white does something like this, and we get this position, this is not a good position, because after g4 and g5 and h4, white has potentials for a very, very powerful attack. Not to mention, they can exchange queens after queen e5, queen takes e5, fe, and having dominating knight on d4 and bad bishop for black. So this is the kind of a doubled pawn that is good for white. And a lot of computers, they cannot, it's very, very difficult, probably, I don't know specifics of programming playing engines, but apparently it's very difficult to teach them when doubled pawns are good and when not. Let me give you some other pawn structure and specifics of it. We just saw the Petrosian's game against David Bronstein, which he won in about 25 or 30 moves, but now we will see another position. We will see position that I had a lot of times against the computers also. c5, bishop d3, knight c6, castle b6, knight e5, bishop b7, f4. Now, let's talk about these positions. What has happened here? Sometimes black took, takes, here we exchange dark square bishops, And even if black plays f5 later and c4. Well, I've had these positions many times with knight on e4 and with knight on d7. Now, with knight on e4 is a less advantage for white because they have to take and position becomes closed. But position with the knight on d7 I had very many times. And it's interesting to notice that after playing king h1 followed by g4, in every case white has tremendous attacking possibilities. The reason why, because bishop on c2 is very powerful. Black is almost never can take f takes g, because after queen takes g4, that's a typical pawn structure disaster. These pawns, white's pawns in the center, completely shutting off black's pieces, and white's advantage here is tremendous. Not to mention though, after rook g1, knight f3 and knight g5, direct attack on black's king will probably be decisive. Make point to e5. Make sure that e5 pawn controls f6 square. Black can never bring the knight for defense, and black has very passive position, and they cannot bring pieces to protect their king. After g6, white may go h4, h5. Very difficult to find any kind of a defense, and maybe even knight f3, followed by knight g5, and practically every white piece is an attack. Black will have no defense here. Obviously, taking on g4 is bad in this position, but if taking on g4 is bad and black goes g6, then we can go king h1, rook g1, and queen f3, and rook f1. We don't have to rush with taking on f5, and what you want to do, maybe play rook f1, rook f2, knight f1, knight g3, and slowly improve your pieces position. How do you determine here what is the ideal position for your knight? The ideal position for your knight is f4, ideal square. And you can do it. You can put the knight on f4. Takes little maneuvering, rook f2, maybe rook g2, knight f1, g3, e2, f4. Because position is closed, pawn structure is very static, and white can take time doing it. Well, obviously, while you do that, you have to be careful not to allow tactical shot like this, knight takes e5, d, d4, which maybe not working in this case because white has e4. But pay attention to some tactical details. Why we could have put the queen on g3, and now we can go even knight f3, h4, preparing possible sacrifice on g6. After g takes f, queen h3, maybe knight g6, or maybe even knight g2 and knight f4. So white has wide varieties of assaulting black's king here. This is the pawn structure. Remember, notice that pawn on e5 is a lot better for white than pawn on f4. Pawn on e5 gives us f4 square for a knight and gives us open f-file, because black is never can afford to take on g4, because that opens our bishop. So this is ideal pawn structure with pawn on e5. So you want to have double pawns, and computers go often frequently for that with black, because opponent has weak doubled pawn, which is incorrect. Now let's look at another game by Petrosian, and as we know, he was the guru of the pawn structures. Now in this game you see, we just saw the game where he had double pawn, and he took advantage of position where he had double pawn. He turned it into his favor. Now we see how he played against the double pawn with more or less similar positions when his opponent had a double pawn. d4, knight f6, knight f3, e6, c4, b6, e3, bishop b7, bishop d3, bishop check, knight b2, d2, knight e4, white castles, black played f5. After queen c2, knight takes d2, white played knight takes d2, black castled, and white played f4. Now black played d5, which gives the frozen pawn structure position. Now let's look at the other possibilities. What white wants to do here, black does not want to give up the dark square bishop, because white is going to play bishop takes d2 followed by e4, and they will have very strong position in the center. So once black played d5, it's clear that white's knight has to go towards e5. Now after d5, knight f3, knight d7, b3, bishop d6, bishop b2, queen e7, and knight to e5. Now it's very interesting to point when white played knight to e5. White went knight to e5 when black cannot capture with a knight, because they're gonna have problems with dark square bishop, because on bishop b4 a3 wins, and on bishop a3 they're gonna have different problem. Bishop takes, queen takes, c takes d, with the weak pawn on c7, or white may even just win this pawn on the next move. So in this position, after knight e5, after white played knight e5, black played knight f6, rook a c1 and c5, queen e2. We didn't get to the pawn structure part yet. Rook a to c8, rook c2, rook c7, rook fc1, rook fc8, queen e1, knight e4. And here we go. Now we see how white clears up position in its center and ending up with a better pawn structure. So what white did here, after queen e1 and knight e4, bishop takes e4, d takes e, and white played d takes c, bishop takes c5 and a4, rook d8 and rook d2. Here is white's bishop on b2 is very powerful and cannot be shut off on completely open diagonal, and rook c to c8, rook c d1, and bishop d6. Black has double pawn on e file, but can they take advantage of it? Can they activate this double pawn? No, these double pawns are frozen, and white practically has an extra pawn on a queen side. Bishop d6, queen g3, bishop takes e5, bishop takes e5. Here we have position with opposite color bishops and slightly better pawn structure for white, and most importantly, white has much stronger bishop. Here what black had to do, they had to do little repair job in their position. So what they had to do is they had to play rook d3. well, to give up a pawn, rook takes d3, ed, rook takes d3, at least have an active bishop. Bishop e4 may be potentially threaten in the future white's pawns. But what they did is they never played rook d3, and they remained with a bad bishop, and white practically has extra pawn on a queen side, and practically they have extra pawn anyway. So rook takes d2, rook takes d2, and g6, making position even worse. Now weaknesses. Now here we have very, very interesting position. This position can be played differently by different players. Well, h4 and h5 as an idea sounds good with potentials of breaking through on king's side, but that's not Petrosian's approach. His approach strictly positional. He played queen g5 here, queen takes g5, f takes g. Okay, here is the case of double pawns on both sides. White's double pawn on g file is totally irrelevant, maybe even better than pawn on f4, because gives them also f6 square for the bishop. Black's pawns are totally frozen and have no future at all on the king side and in the center. Meanwhile, white has an extra pawn on a queen side and open d file. After bishop to c6, you see, but right now there is no way for white to break through or do anything, because black holds all the penetration squares. So after bishop c6, king f2, king f7, and here it's interesting that every time Petrosian has double pawn, he takes advantage of it, and every time his opponent has double pawns, he takes advantage of that too. His opponent's double pawns are bad, and Petrosian's double pawns are good. And that's the case, because white goes with the king on g3, f4, and farther on penetrating on the dark squares. King g3, king e8, king f4. Bishop to d7, bishop d6, a6, and king e5. Now we can say that black's position is totally lost. They played b5, ab, ab, c5, and after rook a8, g3, and after rook a1, king on f6 was already, and rook h1, bishop e5, and white very shortly won this game. Actually, very beautifully managed issues of the pawn structure. You see, white has doubled pawn on g file, and it favors them because king penetrated to f6. Black has double pawn on e6 and on e file, and that's a big problem for them. So that's why when you have the position with double pawns or any structure, it has to be treated and evaluated logically. What are advantages of me having double pawn? What good in it? Does it open me extra file? Does it control more squares in the center? Does it let me perform some kind of an attack on a king side or queen side? If it's not, then what's the point of having double pawns? So this has to be very, very carefully examined before we go to certain pawn structure. I just show you some of them, and there is no way of getting some pawn structure, of showing some pawn structure and just saying, oh, this is right and this is wrong. This goes for every opening and middle game position as well as every end game position. pawn structure is very important in endgame positions. Remember that pawn structure, the fact of importance of pawn structure, that it's kind of thing that sometimes if you have a damage in your pawn structure, and if it's not good, there is no way you can repair it, because pawns are the only pieces on the board that don't go back. So if you moved your pawn and created some kind of a weakness, there is no way to repair it. Pawns don't go back. Every other piece does. If your piece stands badly, your knight, you may maneuver this knight to better position and do some kind of repair job on that. Well, you cannot do this with a pawn. So now let's look at this endgame position. Now we see the endgame position where is black's move. Black has an extra exchange. White has powerful knight on d5, and white has a pawn for an exchange. Let's look at what black did here is played rook takes d5, pawn takes d5, and king takes d5. Now, black has pawn structure that normally in the middle game would be total disaster. Black has horrible pawn structure for the middle game because they have 3 pawn islands plus 1 pawn on b3 that stops 2 pawns on b4 and c5, and white has good pawn structure on the king side. That would be very bad pawn structure for black in the middle game, and winning pawn structure for them in the end game. This position is totally winning for black. The reason why, they just sacrificed exchange back, and now there is a threat of a c4 check. Now, this potential, here on queen side, black has potential pass pawn. So white has to deal with c4. They cannot go king e3, because after king e3, black goes c4 anyway. They cannot go king c2, because then black goes king d4. And after rook a2, black goes rook a2 check. And they're going to win all pawns unless white goes rook b2. But then black wins easily by exchanging rooks, creating pass pawn, and then marching with the king to the king side and winning all white's pawns. So giving that now, you see this. So can you tell in this position whether this pawn structure is good for white or for black? You can't. Well, you put a lot of pieces on the board, it's going to be a horrible position for black. And you put the kings only on the board and rooks, and it's going to be winning for black. Everything has to be analyzed logically, carefully, and you know that endgame pawn structure has different rules than middle game pawn structure. But even inside of endgame pawn structure, we can see, well, if you put here dark square bishops instead of rooks, again, white has big advantage. You put rooks, white is lost. The reason we do it with bishop, because black has no chance of creating pass pawn here, and black definitely creates pass pawn with the rooks. So that makes huge difference. So it needs custom approach. Every pawn structure, it's so important in the opening, in the end game. Now let's look at one very interesting position. What we have to do? Well, this goes for the strategy of endgames. Strategy of endgames will be absolutely meaningless without pawn structure. Strategy in the endgames, 90%, maybe 80% is the pawn structure. So let's get the multiple piece endgame. Okay, minor piece or multiple piece. So, well, here is the position. Here is this position, and well, suppose we have kings here and here. This type of position. This at black's move. What is the correct move for black? A4. This is the pawn, determines the pawn structure, gives white permanent weakness on B2. And after bishop E5, B pawn will need a lot of attention. Position will be bad. On the other hand, if it's white's move, after white playing A4, they're going to have the advantage because black's A5 pawn is a problem. So we know rule, it actually the same rule in the opening, well, in the middle game and end games, that try to keep your pawns on the colors opposite of your bishop, not to make yourself a bad bishop, and not to give yourself permanent weaknesses. There is interesting position. Black is a pawn down, but black has very good pawn structure, and white's dark square bishop, white's only bishop, actually is a bad piece without any future. And black has absolutely perfect pawn structure, but as I mentioned, they are pawn down. In this position, black played rook b7. Let's see how much more important here the pawn structure and not the quantity of pawns. Rook a1, rook h to b8, and white played rook to b to a2, and obviously black wants to avoid opening of a file, and black played b4, and after king to d3, b takes c, king takes c3. Now white goes rook to b1, white to find some way to penetrate into the white's position. Black has to find some way. Rook b1 and rook a3, and now black played rook b8 to b7. Well, the type of position it is, it doesn't really matter what move black makes. It's important what plan black chooses, because the moves, they can go rook b8 and rook b7 or king a7, because position is very, very static. So they have to have correct plan. Rook b8 to b7, king on d2, king on a7. Now white played rook takes b1, and after rook takes b1, rook to c3. And when black played king to b6, now this is very interesting position. In this position, white played rook to b3, hoping to exchange rooks because black's rook is a lot more active. And here we got the position knight versus bishop with 7 pawns for white and 6 for black. Basically, when we know when there are a lot of pawns on the board, the knight normally is a better piece than a bishop. But extra pawn is still very, very important factor. In this position, however, black played knight to h4 and making exchange. They try to make exchange of a bishop for a knight. If bishop takes h4, then pawn takes h4. Well, and here white made the fatal mistake. They did take this knight. Now, basically, when you see pawn endings, and if one of the sides has an extra pawn, I would say at least 90% of the time the position, the side with extra pawn and pawn ending is winning. But after g takes h, even though we do see 7 pawns for white and 6 for black, position is totally lost for white. Why? Because white practically does not have 7 pawns, because black's 2 pawns on h4 and f4 safely shut these pawns on h3, g2, and f3. An extra pawn on g2 is totally insignificant. But then, when white played king c3, black played c5, and what happens now is white has to make moves. Whatever, if white takes on c5 or black takes on d4, it doesn't make any difference at all. The bottom line here is that black is going to have protected pass pawn, which is very, very important in end game, and it's also important in the middle game. This is very big commodity. So after king to c6, white has to go back king d3, and king c5, king d4, king c3, and now black wins with d4 check, king d3, and king to d5. Now white has 2 moves: either go back with the king, then black simply takes the e pawn, comes back to c5, goes king b4 and e5. So that's going to be an easy win. And if white tries b4, then a takes b, and after a5, b3, and on a6, king c6. Black is in a square, stops the a6 pawn, and white cannot touch any of black's pawns. That's an easy win. Very instructive, very thematical. How pawn structure in this position was more important than the quantity of pawns. White actually lost the pawn ending where black had no threats. White lost the pawn ending with extra pawn, and they never made a mistake. Mistake was going to this endgame. Now, let's look another very interesting position, bishop versus knight. Well, here is the position that was played poorly by white. I'm going to give you a position. It's actually very typical mistake by a weaker player. King on d7, knight on e7, and white has pawns, and black has king on g2, bishop on c5, and pawns on a6, b5. Here is the position. Black is doing fine here. What black should have done, they probably could have gone simply g6, stop f5 break, and later on maybe knight c6. But what they did, they played h5 move. Positionally very sound, but practically bad move. h5 is understandable idea. They want to get control on f5 square. If white takes on h5, for example, then we go knight f5, and it's a very nice square for knight. Or if white plays g5, is the same thing, and black is going to have an advantage. However, bishop takes e7, king takes c7, and g takes h. This is very, very good example. This is exact prototype of the endgame we just saw a couple of minutes ago. Now, white has double pawns, and g pawn stops both of those pawns, and black has protected pass pawn, but white has an extra pawn. But this time, white is the winner, not black. What happened? King f7, king f3, king g8, black is coming over to get the pawn on h5. The important fact here, important detail, that black does have protected pass pawn, but it's very temporary because white is going king e3, king d4, followed by f5, and black cannot stop it. So after king h7, king d4, king h6, f5, you see now white creating pass pawn, and in this position white played king d5, which was not necessary. They could have played e6, king d5, and after king takes h5, e6, and they making queen after e7 and e8 with the check. So black's f4 is delayed, and after king g6, king d6, with an easy win for white. So you see, in both cases, one of the sides was pawn down but had protected pass pawn, and in one case protected pass pawn won, and in the other case they lost. So position, when you play pawn structure, it's another proof that there is no winning pawn structure in general. There is winning pawn structure that has to be applied to certain positions. It may work in certain positions, it may not. But basic rules that to have connected pass pawns is very good, and to have protected pass pawn almost in every endgame is also very good, but you have to look at a concrete position. When you have protected pass pawn, what your opponent has for it, what their counter chances are, and you see that protected pass pawn won in one case and lost in the other. So this is very important to be analytical. When you have a pawn structure, you have to know the basic rules that to have a lot of isolated pawns are not good. But of course, every rule has an exception. Every rule in chess has an exception. Well, if we start from like an ABC of chess, develop pieces in early stage, I can give you a couple of examples that we don't develop and it turns out good. Same piece makes few moves. But this is very rarely happens. So that's why we need to have custom approach to those examples. Here, let me show you interesting position in a pawn structure. Well, here is white's position. Here is position. White has an extra pawn. White is easily winning here, and here is why. Well, what white is going to do is white is going to go king f3 and wait until black makes the move to go king g4. Well, suppose black made the move king g6, after king g4, king f6. Now we go d6, king e6, king takes g5, king takes d6, and king to f5 or king to f6. Now, this is very thematic, very methodical. White wins the c pawn. Black cannot stop it. So white took advantage of protected pass pawn. So they exchanged their advantage, one type of advantage for the other type. They gave away protected pass pawn. They exchanged protected pass pawn for a weaker pawn to actually, in this position, black's move. If they go g4, then we go d6, king e6, king takes g4. They exchanged pass pawn for a weaker pawn, and what they got for it, very advanced kings, that eventually white king squeezes black's king out of c5 square, and white wins easily. It's interesting that the interesting fact, if pawn was on a5, that's why white won. If pawn was on a7, that would have been a draw. And the reason why it's a draw, because black plays a6 move. And now after king f6, black goes king c6, king e6. That's just the entertaining part of this endgame. Now black goes king b6, and after king d6, king to a5, a very amusing position, which is a draw. Black goes king b6, king a5, and there is no way white can ever make a progress, because they cannot play king takes c5. It's an obvious stalemate. So, very interesting example. So what we do, it's like a formula here. What you do, you distract black's king in order to gain very active position with your king. Well, the way it happened, actually, black has, if it's white's move, we have to make, you see, immediate d6 is not good, because white goes king e6, and after king g4, king takes d6, king takes g5, and king e5. And black penetrates itself. So the correct way to do, make sure when we give the d pawn for white, we keep black's king locked in on the queen side. So the way we do it, we're making waiting move, and if black goes king e5, king g4, king f6, and now black's king cannot come out, because king e6, king takes g5, king takes d6, and now king f6 or king f5, and white wins easily. Now let me give you an example of another, actually very interesting example of a protected pass pawn that occurred in from the rook ending. White king on g1, rook on f4, and white has three pawns on a3, b2, c5, g2 and h3, and black has pawns on a4, b7, c6, and d5, and also g7, h7, and king on the g8 with the rook on e3. In this position, this is lost position for white, because white played rook a4, and now black goes rook b3. Black wants to play rook takes b2, where they gonna have extra pawn in rook ending, protected pass pawn on d5, and also weak pawn for white on c5. So white did rook b4, but then it's even better for black. Black played rook takes b4, a takes b4, and king f7. Now black practically has an extra pawn, king f7, because they have pawn on d5, and b7 and c6 pawn, they hold white's three pawns, king f2, king e6, king e3, king e5, and this position is easily won for black, because whatever white does here, it doesn't really matter, g4 or g3, black is going to go d4 check and king d5. What is black going to do? Tempos don't make any difference, because black has all the time in the world playing king to e5 and king to d5 until white's king moves from d3 square, and then black penetrates with a king on e4, and then plays d3, then goes king d4, and eventually all those pawns on a queen side gonna fall, and black is gonna win easily. This is the classical example of protected pass pawn. So that protected pass pawns, a huge majority of the time, they represent strength. They are big strength and big commodity. Okay, here is interesting position where white has two connected pass pawns versus black's two outside pass pawns. Well, even if position was like this, white has a huge advantage here. White, well, I would say probably winning here. So white can go rook a2, and after black goes rook d6, rook a5, check, and pawns start moving. It's very difficult in rook ending for white to move these pawns, and they move, pawns move, and also push black's pieces in the back, and black is unable to create substantial counterplay. So white is winning here. Just to give you an example, king e7, e5, rook b6, king e4, and if black plays g5, then rook c5, on g4, maybe rook c7 check, and king to d8, rook to g7, and you see black is already lost. But even if they could protect their pawn with the rook, black goes king d5, king d6, and then d5 and e6. White wins easily. Now look at this position, and we say, does it mean that when one side has two connected pass pawns against separated on both separated on two separated pawns, one on king and one on queen side, does that mean this is always winning? No. Well, and again, pawn structure is needs very concrete approach. We are winning here because it's rook ending. But just let's for a minute take rooks off the board. Now we have exact opposite result. White is totally lost, because when white pushes d4, black activates their one pass pawn, and eventually white's pawn is going to be stopped. And when white goes toward this pass pawn, black activates second pass pawn. And it's easy to see that white cannot catch two pass pawns on opposite sides of the board. So therefore, white is absolutely lost. So any pawn structure that is normally considered very good and a winning pawn structure, we can make slight change, and it's going to be exactly the opposite. So strategy for creating pawn structure has to be combined with strategy of your plan, of the pieces you have on the board, and of the type of position, and most importantly, with your plan. This is very interesting fortress that white built. Here is a position where black has an extra rook, and it's regardless whose move is it. If white's move, they go king g2, king g1. They never make any other move. White wins easily. So black cannot do anything. So what can black do? Black then can rook h3, we go king g2. There is nothing black, in order for black to win, they have an extra rook. Of course, the fact that white has two pawns for rook, it's totally insignificant. What is important is they have two pawns, they create all entry squares. And black cannot penetrate, so white is going to go king g2, king g1, and there is no way black is going to make progress. King g2, if black goes rook g2, we go king f2 or king h2. And if black goes rook g7, we go king g2. And on rook h7, king g1, there is no way for black to make any progress. And if they don't make any progress, if they cannot penetrate, obviously they cannot win. So position is totally drawn. So here is a pawn structure that normally, well, it's just a normal pawn structure. Sometimes creating certain pawn structure is so important, and this is a good example we see now, that even being rook down, we manage to draw this position. So important thing here is to cover all the entry squares for black, from black rook. So based on examples we saw, just remember the pawn structure is not individual, unrelated subject that you have to know it has to be applicable. Correct pawn structure must be applicable to the concrete position. What can seem like a very good structure in one position, if you make slight changes in the presence of different pieces, it can completely change the evaluation of the pawn structure. So it's very important understanding, not learning pawn structure, not remembering it, but understanding it, what pawn structure is applicable to what type of position. So without learning it, you can never be a good all-round player. So master on pawn structure, that will definitely increase